March 8th, 1862. 152 years ago today, the Battle of Pea Ridge met its bloody conclusion. The day prior to the 8th, March 7th, the Union Army had had mixed results against the Confederates. The Battle of Pea Ridge began on March 7th, but it was really two separate battles when it began. General Earl Van Dorn's Army of the West had marched around the Union force but had been detected. Two separate divisions on Van Dorn launched large-scale attacks against the Union Army, which was split. One of those forces attacked the Union troops near Leetown. That attack had failed more or less totally. The Confederate division commander was killed in the attack, which, despite having overwhelming numbers, seemed to falter as a result of poor command and control following the death of the division commander. Then, in the midst of a further attack, his second-in-command was killed. The Confederate division basically devolved into a non-functioning unit and was very convincingly pushed back or defeated by a much smaller but more effectively led Union force, which lacked the confusion which comes from losing both your first and second in command. Meanwhile, at Elkhorn Tavern, the story was very different. Here the Union Army had been pushed back from defensive position after defensive position. Despite fighting bravely, the Union force was clearly bested near Elkhorn Tavern and had been pushed back nearly a mile from their original positions after heavy fighting on the 7th of March. Fortunately for the Union, the success at Leetown meant that the Union could repurpose the divisions there and link up with the force at Elkhorn Tavern, forming a single unified body of their army. They were still outnumbered by the Confederates, who were able to do the same, bringing in their battered division from Leetown and unifying the army. But when the battle began on the morning of March 8th, the initiative had passed from the Confederates to the Union. General Earl Van Dorn, who was commanding the Confederate Army of the West, decided not to attack in the morning, and that gave General Samuel R. Curtis, commander of the Union force, plenty of time to prepare a well-thought-out attack and push back the Confederates, leading to an ultimate Union victory in the Battle of Pea Ridge. The result of the Battle of Pea Ridge was that the Confederacy would forever lose Missouri. While the battle was fought in Arkansas, a Confederate victory here would have allowed them to re-enter Missouri and attempt to re-establish control over that state. The Union victory and the subsequent withdrawal of General Earl Van Dorn's forces from Arkansas forever ended the serious threat that Missouri might join the Confederacy in anything more than a token matter. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Matthew, and I'm the Historical Gamer. Today I'm going to be recreating that fateful day, March 8th, 1862. I'll be taking on the role of General Samuel L. Curtis in command of the Army of the Southwest, and my goal is to push General Earl Van Dorn's Confederate Army of the West from the field and forever win the state of Missouri for the United States of America. Whether I will be as successful as Curtis or not is yet to be seen, but over the next half an hour or so, we will see. Now, the video has already been recorded, the gameplay that is. I'm going to be editing down certain parts of the game so that this is in a more viewable format. I don't see much point in playing the entire 90-minute battle here and showing you every little bit of the fight. That would probably be a bit redundant. What we're looking at right now is the preliminaries, the artillery bombardment, which Samuel L. Curtis launched at the beginning of the battle, and I'll talk a little bit about the history of the battle as we fight here. But first of all, if you are not already aware, this battle, or this game that we are watching right now, is being created using the video game Scourge of War Gettysburg. Pea Ridge was not included with the Scourge of War Gettysburg release, nor was it included in any of the 4 subsequent paid DLC packs which came out with the game. It's one of a couple of mods which were released by the creators of the Scourge of War game as a free downloadable content or a free mod which allows you to fight the battle in several scenarios as well as give you access to the maps for the multiplayer. So, as you will, it's free downloadable content. If you own Scourge of War Gettysburg, you can play this. You don't have to pay anything extra. Now, moving on to the actual fight on March 8th, let's talk a little bit about what actually happened and what's going on our screen here as well. And we'll see. Hopefully I will be able to be as successful as Samuel Curtis. I will say I'm not the best player when it comes to scale of attack. I prefer divisional or brigade level scenarios, although I've certainly fought my share of larger scenarios. This one's a little bit larger. The Union Army is kind of the size of a large division at only about 10,000 men. General Earl Van Dorn's force started the battle with about 16,000, so a very healthy numerical advantage. Now, as we already said, however, the Confederates abdicated responsibility and abdicated the initiative on the morning of March 8th. Curtis had actually formed his army up and waited attack, but General Earl Van Dorn did not oblige and did not attack him in the early morning hours of March 8th. So, knowing that he could now deploy his forces as he saw fit, General Curtis decided to take the initiative and attack the Confederates. Quite a bold move, if you will, in a scenario where he was outnumbered fairly heavily, but nonetheless it is what Curtis decided to do. Now, what General Curtis did to start the attack was actually formed a grand battery, if you will, across the entirety of it, the front of his line. You can see here right now we're in the midst of an artillery duel with the Confederates. We've got quite a bit of pieces of artillery, especially for a force that only numbers about 10,000 men. This was one of the few times which artillery was effectively used to soften up enemy positions. That is something you didn't see happen a whole lot during the Civil War. But on the morning of March 8th, the Union Army had actually formed up an artillery battery and began to pound Confederate positions very effectively. The Confederates, as you can see here, have some artillery batteries out in the open, and that's what the Union Army focused on, driving off Confederate batteries. The initial batteries were driven off, and Dorn sent further batteries in, and those were driven off as well. It should be noted, and it is somewhat interesting to me, that General Curtis, who did not get along at all with one of his divisional commanders, General Franz Segal, who was in fact a German-born immigrant, and about half the army that Curtis commanded were German immigrants as well, who had fled to the United States largely after the 48 rebellion, the 1848 rebellions which took place in modern-day Germany through the various kingdoms which existed there, had failed. Many of them had fled to the United States, and Segal and many of his men believed that he should have been in command of the Union Army. Neither side liked each other. General Earl Van Dorn had similar conflicts with command, where General Sterling Price and Generals Ben McCulloch both hated each other, two of his divisional commanders commanding two of his wings of his army. Perhaps cruelly fate would resolve that conflict, however, as General Ben McCulloch had been commanding the division at Leetown the day before and had been mortally wounded. But the reason I brought up General Franz Segal is this massed bombardment which took place on the morning of March 8th was actually organized and handled by General Segal. Curtis showed a remarkable amount of trust and confidence in Segal throughout the battle, which is somewhat shocking when you consider the fact that these two men really did not get along at all. I think it really speaks to General Curtis's professionalism and his desire to win, that he was willing to entrust a key part of his army's planning to someone who in many cases wanted his predecessor to fail. And it wasn't out of the ordinary or out of question to have generals allow their political or personal opinions get in the way of their combat effectiveness. To General Segal's credit, he did a very good job of fighting this fight, despite the fact that after the battle both would fight over who was more responsible for the victory here. Neither one of them seemed to allow their generalship to be affected by their own personal disagreements, which, again, for a Civil War army is quite impressive to see that level of professionalism show in the armed forces, and it definitely did both commanders credit that despite their own personal misgivings, they did not allow that to affect the way in which they commanded the army. A brief mention, I have moved the game into an accelerated period where I'm kind of fast forwarding through some of the artillery barrage. I believe it's ×2 or ×3 or 4 or something like that with regards to the speed. You can see the clock is moving there much quicker, and the artillery is firing much quicker as well. Alright, so we're fast forwarding a bit. The artillery barrage has been going on for nearly 40 minutes. I didn't see the need to have us just sitting there and watching cannons fire at each other. Now, my artillery barrage was not as effective as the historical one. In reality, a entire Confederate regiment was actually driven from their positions based on the intensity of this artillery fire, as well as the Confederate cannons being nearly entirely neutralized in the process of the engagement as well. So that's something that almost never happened in the Civil War. It's what General Lee attempted at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3rd when he launched General Pickett's division across an open field to attack a Confederate position, or I'm sorry, attack a Union position, and he was shot to ribbons. The artillery simply was not effective. Union artillery was typically much more effective than Confederate artillery, as it had more reliable fuses and in some cases better trained crews, but at the same time the Union almost never drove an enemy unit from position. This is one of the rare times that that did occur, and it does give credit to General Sigal's placement and use of the artillery pieces in softening up the Confederate positions. The attack with which General Curtis organized on March 8th might have been one of the rare times in which an entire army went into an attack. It certainly was not the largest single moving attack of the war. Perhaps General Longstreet's attack at 2nd Manassas was as large. If not then, I know the attack by General Longstreet at Chickamauga was also similarly large in scope, manpower, and effect. However, with that being said, it might be the only time that literally almost an entire army lined up in a single line of battle and prepared for an attack. Now, historically, the entire Union Army was not actually put into the attack, however, as the divisions under General Carr, who had been badly mauled the day before at Elkhorn Tavern, was held back. Perhaps to Curtis and the Union Army's own detriment. The attacks would end up being successful, and had the Union launched their entire army forward, it's possible rather than just pushing the Confederates back, it may have been a rout. But either way, the attack went forward, and the Union forces were formed up in a long line of blue, almost all in sight of each other. That it's also another one of those rare times, except for obviously some of the small skirmishes, where an entire army would line up and nearly be in sight of each other from one end of the line to the other. It must have been an impressive sight, with some 10,000 men moving across these fields at the enemy. But nonetheless, the Union had launched their attacks on March 8th and would end up being successful. Now, the attacks were unintentionally launched in echelon, with General Sigal commanding the two left Union divisions, attacking the Confederate right across the Union left. They ended up pushing back the Confederates there and breaking their position. You can see there was almost a salient there where there was an L forming on the Confederate line, which makes them more vulnerable there. Then in the center, General Curtis also sent a Union division forward to attack the center of the Confederate line. As I already said, he held General Carr's division on the far right in reserve and did not launch the attack against the Confederates there, although he may have ended up in a better situation if he had, because the Confederates were actually retreating across his lines. When the Union pushed the Confederates back, the Confederates withdrew from their own right flank, the Union left, where the attack started, across through the center, and then across their own left, or across the Union right. It's easy to get directions turned about when you're talking left and right flanks for armies, especially in this time, but for the rest of this scenario, I'm going to be referring to the Union position, because that's where I am right now. I'm taking a quick look through there. You can see I've already pushed one Confederate regiment out of their positions. The Confederates have a strong defensive position along a wood line and also a fence line, and also it looks like they've got some double lines here toward the center and my right. So my attacks here may not meet with quite as much success. Furthermore, most of my artillery which is supporting is on the left, not on the right, so we'll see how that plays out here. As I mentioned in my previous video, which covered the Battle of March 7th, it seems that the armies in the West tended to have a much higher percentage of cavalry than the armies of the East, or even the central fronts, if you will. For one reason or another, Missouri always seemed to have a pretty healthy supply of cavalry in any of the few engagements which did take place in the Trans-Mississippi region. I think this is an interesting battle in that, because of that massive open fields and attacking across an open field, you really kind of get a positive sense of the way Scourge of War handles battles. Obviously, this isn't going to necessarily compare with the likes of Total War in terms of graphics and 3D modeling, because these sprites you see on the screen are actually 2D sprites, they're not 3D. But one thing that this game does have that the Total War doesn't have, in addition to the pretty simple to use interface and the ability to command much larger forces through units like brigades and divisions more effectively than is possible, is just a scale and a scope which simply doesn't exist in a Rome game. You don't see battles with this many sprites on the screen, and you don't have the ability to effectively lead this many different units and pieces, where the AI will do a lot of work for you when you are the commander. In this battle, I'm kind of leaving it up to the other commanders as much as I can. I did have to manually select some of the units to get them to attack where I wanted them to attack, but now that the attack is taking place, I can kind of let my own commanders do what they want, do what they need to do, and just give them little nudges and trips here and there to try and push them on a little bit further. I really enjoyed taking a look at the battlefield from the ground level, almost like you're your own soldier. I'm not playing in headquarters in the saddle mode, which is a version of the game you can set up so that you only see what your character would see from the seat of the saddle, my character being General Curtis. But I do enjoy, kind of getting that look hit there as well. Another interesting thing, which didn't take place in a whole lot of battles, is this fight was fought it was March, but it was kind of the winter, if you will. The night before, the temperatures had fallen precariously, I believe below freezing, and as you can see here, there's at the very least frost and possibly a little bit of snow on the ground in this map, which is accurate to the fight. There weren't many fights fought during the Civil War during cold temperatures, and this is the fighting itself on the day of wasn't as cold, but this is one of those few examples of a battle fought in nearly winter-like conditions. For the most part, armies during the Civil War time frame really only fought in ideal kind of spring, summer, fall conditions. Rarely would they ever fight in winter-like conditions. You can see here, it looks like my troops are starting to kind of take some withering fire here on my own right. I don't have a whole lot of support over there. I'll need to bring in some additional troops to kind of strengthen the line there. On the far left, the Confederates had launched a counterattack with cavalry, but I am holding my own at the very least. Again, this view from my character, Samuel Curtis's saddle, or kind of close by, is one of my favorite views to look at when fighting a battle. Pea Ridge was interesting in many ways, and microcosm of many other battles as well, but I think the thing that kind of stood out the most is that, to me, it's very similar to another major battle which would take place a little bit later, Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh was an example where the Union Army was surprised by a larger Confederate force on the first day of the battle. It was pushed back, nearly defeated, and rallied and received reinforcements that night to launch a counterattack against Confederate forces the following day and win a clear victory against a large Confederate force that ended up sealing the fate of a state. In the case of Shiloh, Kentucky would never, well, I guess you could say Perryville threatened Kentucky, but in the case of Shiloh, I suppose you could say that the Confederates never really were able to engage the Union on such equal terms after the battle, and the fate of Kentucky and northern Tennessee as well was more or less sealed with that defeat. Certainly, the fate of northern Tennessee, as Nashville was lost, and more or less for the rest of the war, I believe for the rest of the war. And then Pea Ridge, as I said already, sealed the fate of the state of Missouri, and more or less despite the fact that there would be further Confederate incursions into Missouri, almost ended the conventional war in the Trans-Mississippi region almost as early as it had started. In some ways, General Curtis was one of the most successful early Union commanders launching this campaign, which The deciding battle was the Battle of Pea Ridge. He would end up going on and invading northern Arkansas, where this battle was fought, threatening Little Rock, having to withdraw due to logistical concerns, but excavating his army fairly easily and with skill. Curtis is one of the few Union commanders early in the war who was professional, successful, and met with a lot of success while also substantial results. So in that sense, he's an interesting character. I would say Grant was probably still more successful early in the war. Around this time frame, he would win the Battle of Shiloh. He had taken Forts Henry and Donaldson. So I wouldn't say Curtis was the most successful Union general early in the war, but he had locked down Missouri as a result of this battle, and had nearly taken Arkansas as a result of this battle. So he certainly accomplished quite a bit. The other thing to be considered and discussed is the fact that General Earl Van Dorn, when his soldiers were pushed back and defeated, he escaped from Arkansas, or he retreated from Arkansas. He basically left Arkansas with his army and headed into Tennessee. He crossed the river, and he headed into Mississippi, and then eventually kind of up toward Tennessee, but actually went into Mississippi is where Van Dorn would lead his force. He kind of was attempting to join Albert Sidney Johnson's large Confederate army, which was gathering for the Battle of Shiloh, but Van Dorn was defeated at Pea Ridge, ended up losing the state of Missouri for good, ended up losing northern Arkansas, and then abandoned his department, which he was in charge of defending, the Arkansas department, and left the region basically to the whims of the Union, and then didn't even arrive in time for the actual Battle of Shiloh. It would be interesting, to say the least, what would have happened at the Battle of Shiloh if the Confederates had another 12, 13, 14,000 more soldiers in that battle. They outnumbered the Union to start the fight, but I think it was like 40 to 30,000 men when the fight started, but by the end of the fight, the Confederates were outnumbered considerably, with the Union force having reinforcements from General Buell's. The total engaged forces ended up being something like 40,000 Confederates, 60,000 Union. If all of a sudden you add 12, 13,000 more Confederates to that, you're looking at a much more even fight, and who knows, those additional soldiers might have been enough to completely rout Grant's forces on the first day of Shiloh, where they were badly mauled and pushed back, but they weren't routed. An additional 12,000 men certainly could have changed the entire outlook of that battle, and who knows, it could have prevented General Albert Sidney Johnson from dying, who, at least if you were to believe General Davis, was one of the best Confederate soldiers. He was very highly regarded, much as General Lee was highly regarded as well, although Lee's stock was not on the rise at this point in time. It still would be interesting if you had a very effective commander in General Albert Sidney Johnson in command of the Confederate forces in the central region, rather than General Braxton Bragg, who was not effective or successful at all, who would end up commanding the Confederate forces after Sidney Johnson's death. So there's a lot of implications, a lot of cause and effect as a result of this battle, and despite that, it is one of the more overlooked battles that was fought during the Civil War, so definitely deserves some coverage, deserves some notice, and whatnot. As you can see, I've jumped ahead again, where I did a few seconds ago here in the fight. You can see I've got a much larger number of troops here engaged on the right, but at the same time several regiments have been forced to retreat as a result of heavy Confederate fire from these strong positions. I wonder if holding Carr back might have been the more intelligent thing to do, as I have met with quite a bit of success here on my left, but not very much in my center or on my right. With the Confederate forces to my right and center, they could certainly launch potentially successful attacks. Now, as I attack here on the left, I'm going to go ahead and we'll see about turning the trees off here for a few seconds, just so I can get a better view maybe of what the Confederates have opposing me. If you are playing Scourge of War and you want to get rid of the trees, you you can actually just tap the T key on your computer board, and it'll cause those to disappear. Also, if you've got a little more mid to lower end machine, you can tap that button. It'll also help improve your performance quite substantially. Trees take up a lot of resources in the game, and this game in general takes up a lot of resources. You know, you could very well have a very high-end rig and not get the greatest FPSs because there are so many sprites on the screen, because there are so many detailed items on the screen. The maps are huge at 5 by 5 miles, thousands of sprites, smoke animation, hundreds of trees and different 3D objects. Despite the fact that the sprites are in 2D, it does all use up quite a bit of resources. I think, you know, my own impression of the game is that it's more CPU intensive than it is GPU intensive, but I'm also not a programmer. You'd have to ask Norb if that's true. As I said, I have been helping the game test, and I'm also helping work on Scourge of War Waterloo, just sort of from a, you know, my own love of the game. So I'll put that out there again for full disclosure. Now, as far as the Battle of Pea Ridge is concerned, it's interesting. Yet, despite the disagreements and dislike between General Segal and General Curtis, Curtis did admit that Segal's performance was superb on the day of March 8th, and he performed very well. However, him and his commander, despite this victory, you know, they also often talk about sports athletes and all you need to do is win and you'll get along. Doesn't seem to be the case, at least with these two gentlemen, as Segal would attempt to take the majority of the credit for the victory here, and their own disagreements with each other would end up leading to Segal's transfer to the east, to Virginia, where he would be thoroughly whipped by General Stonewall Jackson in the valley, and suffer somewhat of his own. He would lead the Union 11th, or a German contingent in the Union 11th Corps, for quite a bit of fighting throughout the eastern campaigns, though he was removed before the disaster of Chancellorsville. Else he may have been scapegoated perhaps more than just the German immigrants who were proud to fight alongside him, and there became a famous slogan which the German soldiers would go by, where they would say, "I go to fight mit Segal," or "I fight mit Segal." Basically, I fight with Segal. And I could be mispronouncing his name because I feel like I'm saying it like Steven Seagal, which is obviously not the same thing, but General Segal's career, while starting off well enough and fighting in both engagements at Wilson's Creek fairly effectively, and then obviously much more effectively at the Battle of Pea Ridge, while it got off to a solid start, he struggled as his career went on. As I said, he was a commander in the Valley during Jackson's Valley campaign, in which the Army was thoroughly embarrassed, including the Segal's division, but he also fought in the Battle of Bull Run, or Second Bull Run, sorry, in which he commanded a corps of Union troops and was embarrassed there, as his army was, or his commander's army, the army he was in, was trounced by General Lee. He would end up commanding that corps through the Battle of Fredericksburg as well, although he was held in reserve. He basically built a reputation as being inept or incapable as a general, which is interesting considering his solid performance at Pea Ridge. I would be interested to see how much of the assessment of his failures was a result of his own actual failures, and how much was a result of maybe being detested or disliked for his immigrant status. I'm not saying he wasn't a bad commander. Again, the results seem to speak to the fact that he didn't have as strong of an ability to command soldiers, but at the same time, Pea Ridge is such a obvious exception to that it seems unusual at the very least, and it certainly wouldn't be out of the question, as his peers and his colleagues were detested in the East by many Union commanders, and were often the scapegoats of Union defeats, and that much is a fact. So, without getting into too much of how good he was or wasn't, he was very good at Pea Ridge. not as much later in his career, and he ended up serving out the war after the Battle of Fredericksburg, largely in secondary or light roles, with the exception of during the Valley Campaign of 1864, when General Jewel Early's corps under General Jewel Early's corps of the Army of Northern Virginia were detached from Petersburg to attempt to draw Union forces away. Sigel was defeated at the Battle of New Market on May 15, 1864, and in that defeat, Sigel was replaced by General Hunter. In July, Sigel would fight General Early at Harper's Ferry as well, but was replaced shortly there afterwards and spent the rest of the war without an active command. So, despite getting off to a pretty solid start to his resume in the war with an impressive performance at Pea Ridge, he would end up languishing the majority of the rest of the war without much in the way of any kind of commands. General Curtis, on the other hand, with his tremendous success, would end up gaining control of the entire theater of Missouri before being removed because of his abolitionist views. Curtis was an interesting character in that he was a successful general and one of the few successful generals during the early days of the war, but because of the political realities of the early war time period, his abolitionist viewpoints were not popular, and Lincoln ended up removing him. He would end up, however, continuing up the ranks and being promoted, and shortly after this battle he was actually promoted to Major General and would end up commanding the Trans-Mississippi Theater, and later would be given command of the Western District, put in charge of dealing with various uprisings of Native American tribes as the war wound down. So he was someone who was in active command or in theater command for a good deal longer, unlike Sigel, and was never really discredited. He was always pretty successful in all of his commands. He would end up fighting the Quantrell raids and the guerrilla actions which took place in Missouri as well, which, as I mentioned in my previous video, Missouri was a mess during the Civil War. After these few initial early war battles, it devolved into a guerrilla campaign, one the likes of which the United States fortunately has not seen since. It was bloody, it was messy, it was barbaric, and it was in many ways almost like an entirely different war over what had been fought anywhere else during the Civil War. While Curtis may have met with more professional success than General Sigel as the war wound on, perhaps his personal life was, obviously, not perhaps, was definitely not as joy-filled. On the same day he found out he had been promoted to Major General, largely in result of his victory at Pea Ridge, that being March 21st, 1862, he also found that his daughter, 20-year-old Sadie, had died back in St. Louis from typhoid fever. That, unfortunately, for General Curtis would not be the only personal tragedy which he suffered. In October 1863, his son, a major, Henry Zariah Curtis, was an adjunct to Brigadier General James Blunt. He was killed by Quantrell's raiders in a surprise attack in the Battle of Baxter Springs. Quantrell's men had worn Federal uniforms and gave no quarter. General Curtis would end up naming a fort in memory of his son, but it's sort of a sobering look at the way things were very different in the Western Theater of Operations and the Trans-Mississippi Theater of Operations. Curtis would meet with more professional success, which perhaps in some way would allow him to exercise his demons and gain some semblance of revenge over the Confederates following that. In 1862, he would fight against Major General Sterling Price, a foe who he had fought at Pea Ridge as well, one of the division commanders of the Confederacy there, and would end up defeating the Army of the Border under General Price's command. General Curtis would win the Battle of Westport, another victory in Missouri, and his last major field command and last major field victory before he was reassigned to deal with the Indian uprisings and whatnot uh, that that he dealt with at the end of his command. Another example of the treachery which took place in Missouri would have been committed by Quantrell's raiders as well. Uh, that was the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas, in which the Confederates basically burned down and killed pretty much everyone in the city of Kansas. Well, the city Lawrence in Kansas. Um, it was it was a messy affair. The entire campaign in Missouri following these initial battles. Wilson's Creek, more or less a stand-up fight. Pea Ridge, a stand-up fight. There were a few other smaller stand-up engagements, but after those fights, for the majority of the rest of the war, because the Confederates were incapable of challenging the Union on the field of battle, resorted to, let's say, questionable tactics, if we're going to be polite about it. But anyway, I'm kind of getting out and just kind of rambling at this point. The engagement is more or less over. There's still fighting going on. There's still men dying. My right flank is solidified in that it doesn't look like the Confederates have enough men to completely crush me and turn my flank, but the soldiers there are certainly not in good shape. My center is strong. We're pushing the Confederates back on the center, and on the left we've all but shattered the Confederate left flank. They still have troops in the field. They're still fighting, and I probably will not win this battle in terms of victory points or anything along those lines. But if we're looking at it strictly from a battlefield position, I think at the end of this engagement, there's no way that the Confederates are not forced to withdraw, having their center pushed back pretty substantially here, and having their left flank entirely trounced. It's basically not there. Um, they do have some reserves kind of further back, but this fight, with only about 12 minutes left in the scenario, this fight is all but over. Um, you know, you can see one regiment retreating. I've got some other regiments which I can call forward, but again, this fight is more or less all but over. So at this point, like I said, I'm not going to win victory point wise. Let's go ahead and fast forward to the end. So just kind of jumping ahead here toward the end, the Confederates brought some more troops down in the center, but the battle is again more or less all but over. Their right is even weaker now, and their center's a little bit stronger. They'd be able to retreat in fairly good order, but from a military standpoint, we have clearly won the day. Again, we won't win in terms of points. We've lost more heavily than historically was lost in the battle, but we also pushed far more aggressively than the Union did historically as well. The Confederate left is broken. They did reform a bit here in the center, and perhaps have enough manpower to push us back, perhaps not. But the game says it's an inconclusive fight. We lost more men than the enemy, 3,300 to 3,000, but from a tactical standpoint, the Union definitely won that battle. Anyway, I just wanted to go ahead and make this scenario about the 152nd anniversary of the Battle of Pea Ridge. I appreciate you tuning in here today, and I hope you learned something, or I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, a comment. Anything really is appreciated. Thank you for watching, and until next time, this is the Historical Gamer signing out.